I know. Well, welcome to migration experience. Hope you appreciate my play on words there. Took me a long time to think that one up. So, welcome. This is a case study that I kind of wanted to talk about. And my name is Kyle Levitan, and I'm a senior developer at Phase 2. I just had a nice headshot done, and just figured I would let y'all know how good it is. Anyway, I senior developer at Phase 2, but at the time of this case study, or at least this migration, I was working for the government as a government contractor at NCEI here in Asheville, National Centers for Environmental Information. Essentially, it is a large data collection center, and there are Drupal sites that I maintain to help, present this data after it was analyzed, essentially. So there was some requirements to migrate the site. It was very old. It was, hang on one second. I'm not seeing my notes. I think it's because I'm mirroring the display. Well, I guess I will do without my notes. That stinks.
Notes are overrated.
I could do it without. Just excuse me if I trip up. So yeah, I was working on a Drupal site that needed to be migrated, and it was from 2013 was the last time it had been designed. It was a Drupal 7, and we made the decision to go to 8 for various reasons, but there were a lot of concerns, just outside of the migration alone. It was a very large website. It had 3 different sections. They all functioned differently. They all had their own data. It was a little frightening, but in addition, there were custom data tables, and that several different modules relied on. It was a very feature module heavy website, in that we were using feature modules to essentially deploy configuration to other instances. I'll talk a little bit more about that. And yeah, there were several complex custom modules. Again, this is outside the realm of migration, but looking at migrating to Drupal 8 as a whole, there's definitely a lot of factors. Everything has to be essentially rewritten. And lastly, there were a lot of views. And unfortunately, views do not migrate. You have to rebuild all your Drupal views. So this experience, this is actually my previous migration experience with Drupal 6 to Drupal 7. Essentially, you had to turn everything off, uninstall all your modules, and it required various methods to get your data successfully ported over. Actually, the turn-off part, if you were feeling lucky, you would turn off and uninstall everything, and then you would try the upgrade button. But that never worked. So I guess the latter was to basically manually migrate all the data over. So there were you'd rebuild all your content types, you would export your data, usually in CSV format, and then you would use feeds, if anybody's used feeds before, to import your data in. And essentially what you were doing with feeds is you were creating a field mapping. You would choose the field in Drupal, and you would map it to the field in, the field in the CSV, and map it to the field in Drupal. So I'll talk a little bit more about why that's important. And then for patching, SQL queries, like this is kind of, you've hit your deadline, and it just has to get done. So you're running whatever code you can to pull over the missing pieces. So before migrating, it was really necessary to do my research. I had no idea really what I was in for. This is the first Drupal 8 project that I ever worked on. Again, I had all those concerns that I highlighted earlier. That was kind of looming over me, so I wanted to make sure I was doing this right. So I started learning about the Migrate API and how this was essentially built into Drupal 8. I was really intrigued by it for good reason, because it essentially facilitates the migrations between Drupal instances. You know, so you could actually go from Drupal 6 to Drupal 8, Drupal 7 to Drupal 8. But not only that, but you could actually do other sites or even just data. I just thought that that was really cool. It didn't matter. You could use a JSON endpoint and essentially migrate that into your site. I like that it utilized YAML syntax. Is everyone familiar with YAML? It's just a really basic markup language. YAML actually stands for yet another markup language, as if there aren't enough out there. But I like it. It's very simple. I'll show you some examples here in just a few. But it makes a lot of sense when you're constructing a one-to-one field mapping. What I mean by that is your source field to your data field, or your destination field. But the coolest thing about Migrate API is that it provides the ability to transform your data. So your old field may not be relevant in its new field. So typically what you have to do is you have to transform it, massage it, if you will, to get it into Drupal 8. So this kind of leads me to like the key components of this migration, and there are sources and destinations. Your source is the source of the migration. It is the source and destinations are the building blocks for kind of the basic data mapping between the two sites. They basically connect your source legacy site to your destination target site. And the good thing about the source and destinations can actually automatically be generated with drush. So it saves a lot of time. I'll talk more about that. So when I say source, I'm essentially saying the existing legacy database, but more importantly, it is also a key component, like I just mentioned. Source is basically it's a method, and it extends the migrate source class, or excuse me, it's an object or class, excuse me, that extends the migrate source class. It basically describes the data to the core Migrate API module, and it allows you to loop or iterate over rows, essentially to prepare your data for a transformation. And then you have the destination. The destination class extends the migrate destination and class, and it allows you to save a destination record per source row. This is, I guess, pretty technical jargon, but I'll get to some more realistic things here in a minute. I'm kind of trying to set the scene here for using some important components that are worth researching and figuring out. Field mapping. So, like I was saying, that one-to-one. This is important. You actually need to make sure that Drupal knows which field is being mapped to the other field and what type of data it is. And then lastly, there's another thing called migration maps. This is important because it is actually the ID of your migration file to the migration map in the database, and this allows for it helps Drupal keep track of the migrations that are happening. It allows you to say roll back a migration if it didn't work properly. It's really kind of a behind the scenes feature of the Migration API. So the analysis of this is, these are some big terms, and we need to read the documentation. It's pretty good. It's gotten a lot better, especially since the Migrate API was fully released with Drupal 8.5. So it is stable. For me, I found it really helpful. I read a lot of blogs and a lot of case studies, and I would actually search GitHub for migration files, and I would kind of learn from what people how they were doing it. I will say be careful of that though, because there is just so much stuff out there that it can be kind of confusing sometimes. And last, watch videos. I watched a lot of videos from other Drupal cons and camps. Just gave me a lot of insight. So the discovery phase. So what I had to do was I had my site, and I know that there was a lot of stuff on there. The first thing to kind of start with is we needed to start creating some documentation. Started to really evaluate what state my Drupal 7 site was in. Well, given that I had a lot of modules, probably had about 300 modules on this site, I needed to make sure that it would successfully port over to Drupal 8. This is a drush snippet here that I found to be really helpful. It creates a CSV file based on all the modules that you have installed or enabled on your website. With that CSV file, you could then open it up in a spreadsheet, and you could have all your module details available to you. Just gives you kind of a leg up in this process. Everyone got that? So during this documentation building, awareness is essential. You start to recognize the depreciated modules that you might have. I was kind of surprised. I didn't realize that we had a depreciated module until I started looking at this. Media field. Has anyone heard of media field? It was a helper module to embed your media into your body content. I'll get to that in a minute. I think I'm getting to a lot of stuff in a minute, but just bear with me. So another thing to be aware of are the contributed modules that you may have in that list that do not have it, that are not available in Drupal 8 yet. This was more of an issue when I was going through this process, but I'm sure it is still a problem. There were a lot of issues for me too, in that I worked in a government capacity, so I couldn't use modules that were in an alpha or beta state. I had to use full released modules, so this was a tough thing to get around. So another thing to be aware of is look for the pre-built migration paths. So a lot of modules these days, a lot of Drupal 8 modules have migration paths built into them. So for example, I don't have my notes, but for example, the geo field. It has, anyone know what geo field is? It's basically just a Drupal field that you can store latitude and longitude data for. So if you want to geolocate your node or your case study, if you will, to a location. Anyhow, the geo field has migration paths to however your location data was stored previously. It will help you migrate that data. Also, review all custom module code. Again, in more respect to like the greater, upgrading to Drupal 8. But yeah, all that custom code has to be rewritten. This was something that was, another big looming challenge. But fear not, because it is actually a lot easier than it seems. Object-oriented programming will make your life so much better. So evaluating, it was really important. I had a lot of content, right? I had 300-something modules. This site had kind of, what my old colleague used to say, been through the meat grinder so many times that it just had a lot of residual elements that maybe weren't really necessary. So it was time to clean house. You want to really clean out everything. There's no point in migrating something or tripping over something that you no longer need in Drupal 8. Maybe it's, just no longer necessary, or maybe there's a module you find that you downloaded several years ago and you're actually not even using it. So get rid of all that stuff. Also, this is a good opportunity to start looking at the current functionality in Drupal 7. So for me, we were using file entity module in Drupal 7. Well, I didn't want to use that anymore because with Drupal 8, you have media entities. It makes a lot more sense to use a core module versus a contributed module. So one thing that I saw was like, okay, well, I need to get all my files migrated to essentially a media entity. Also, field collections. Field collections is no more. Paragraphs is, I shouldn't say no more. It's still there, but the adoption is a lot less compared to paragraphs. Paragraphs is like field collections, but a lot better. People have any questions on field collections or paragraphs?
Is there a migrate path for field collections to paragraphs already?
That's a good question. At this time, there wasn't. There was a lot of development, and there was a lot of hair pulling to get field collections migrated to paragraphs. I think that progress has actually come a long way. I would need to look up on that status, but if anything, I have my information. I'm happy to. I can't obviously go over everything that I experienced in this migration, but if anybody has any questions, I've got maybe some content. I've got some business cards I can hand out. You can shoot me an email or something if you got a question. All right, so the preparation. So to prepare for the migration, I had to set up I had to set up a local development environment. That I already kind of had, but I'm putting that in there in case someone didn't have the development environment. With that, I wanted to do this locally. So I had to create 2 Drupal instances. One for my legacy site, so that's the Drupal 7 site. So essentially just a copy of my Drupal instance, and then the new Drupal 8 target site. I had to install that. Do not touch anything in it, because as soon as you start creating content and things, it will start conflicting with the migration, and you have node ID conflicts and things like that. Don't even play around with it. Just fresh install and don't touch it. One important thing is to make sure you have your legacy site files folder locally, because during the migration process, those files are actually transferred from Drupal 7 to the Drupal 8 files directory.
What if the site is still active and being changed in your live site? How are you going to catch up?
Yeah, so we'll get to that in a minute. It's kind of at the end, I have some maybe suggestions and tips for, because we all face that same problem, that dilemma of content is constantly being created, and but there is some ways migration will help that, so help keep you caught up. So Migration API. It's core. It's in core. There are some essential modules to get the Migrate API working. You need to install the Migrate module, Migrate Drupal, and Migrate Drupal UI if you're interested. Essentially, the Migrate module is the general API framework. This is what you're going to be working with mostly. The Migrate Drupal module basically facilitates the configuration of Drupal to Drupal migrations. And then the UI is a place where you can actually go and maybe see more of a visual form of your migration files, a little bit more human readable. And I think you can actually run migrations from there. Personally, at the time when I was doing this was really buggy. And I just prefer to work in command line with drush, which I'll talk about in the next slide or so. Drush makes migrations, to me, a lot easier. So, contributed modules. So when I was just talking about with drush, these are really helpful modules that give you additional drush commands. Migrate upgrade. It provides all these nice upgrade commands. Or excuse me, the migrate module, migrate upgrade, just provides the migrate upgrade command. Migrate plus and migrate tools. Those are more drush specific. That'll really help you migrate and roll back your migrations, debug, things like that. All right, so I talked about having the two instances. You have your Drupal 7 instance and you have your Drupal 8 instance. They essentially live next to each other in your local development environment. And inside your Drupal 8 instance, you've got your settings.php or your local.settings.php. Essentially what you need to do is you need to create a legacy database array. So just like you have your default Drupal 8 database array, which tells Drupal 8 to connect and pull data from, you need to tell Drupal 8 to be able to pull data from Drupal 7. So that's the whole point of creating this legacy array. And you'll see the keys of the database array. One says target, one says legacy. Yep. So at this point, what you're going to want to do, or at least the path that I took, was after doing a lot of research, I came to find that migration is, some real essential parts of the migration is the configuration that's exported out. Generally, what you can do is, from my findings was that during this process, you build the configuration first. The configuration is what looks at the Drupal 7 database and compares it to the Drupal 8 database, and it generates the source and destination code that will be necessary for running migrations. This configuration is for each piece of data, so like fields, not fields specifically, but fields as a whole, field storages, content types, taxonomy, term or vocabularies, files, things of that nature. So if you've got a lot of content, a lot of content types, a lot of fields, things like that, it's generally good practice to put it in a custom module that you can then kind of port around, and you've got everything nice and stored in a centralized location. So, has anyone used Drupal console? People using Drupal console? Yeah. It's a great tool. One of the greatest things about it is that it can generate a lot of boilerplate code for you. And in this instance, by running this command, Drupal generate module, and then I'm just basically assigning all this stuff. I want it to be called, custom migrations. I gave it a machine name, a path to where I wanted it to live. I can give it a description. Basically, all your essentials for creating a custom module. So now that I have a custom module in place, and I'm able to connect to both databases, I needed to basically generate that upgrade configuration. So I needed to know what was in Drupal 7 and how it could be ported to Drupal 8, just the default code. So by running this command right here, generates all this configuration. Kind of behind the scenes, it's actually in the database is where all this is stored, in the Drupal 8 database. So with that said, all that data needs to actually come out of the database, and I want to put it into a flat file. This is what's great about config export, because then you can version control it, you can keep track of your work, keep it stored, securely. So what I'm doing here, I exported all that configuration that I just generated, and I'm putting it into a temporary directory. I'll tell you why, because this config export basically takes everything in the database and does a full site config export. I don't need all that stuff. I only need the migration files. So this is a little messy, sorry about that, but it's a really long file. What this is doing is saying, go to that temp directory that I just exported all those files in, and move just the migration specific files and put them in my custom module that I just created. But I'm going to put it in a folder called config and install. What you wind up getting is like a ton of files like this, depending on how big your site is. I mean, I had pages of this, but it looks a little intimidating, but I guess it just goes back to, how big your site is, and it would determine how many files are actually exported out. So really with these files, the intent is to just edit some of these, make the adjustments that you need to do. That default, that boilerplate code will get you surprisingly really far. But going back to, those things where you've got, a depreciated module, or you want to convert or transform data, say from, to the geofield module, or the files to media entities, so forth. So you would actually locate those specific migration files, make your changes there, and then when you're ready, be able to run a full migration. So I talked about drush being helpful from the command line. If you run this command here, this basically runs drush help, and then it pulls out, it just filters out just the commands that have migrate in them. I guess it's just kind of a fancy way. I guess you could say drush migrate and then help, and it would give you pretty much the same information. But this is just a list of commands that you can run, and I had to kind of study these because had to use these quite a bit, especially in the testing phases. So some important ones to highlight: obviously, migration import, migrate rollback. Well, let me explain. What migrate import is: if you run this command followed by the migration file name that out of that big list that I showed you, it will essentially migrate the data over. If you wanted to do file by file, migrate rollback is helpful, as if you ran that migrate import command, something happened, or you went to the Drupal 8 database and checked it out and it was broken. So essentially you would want to roll back that migration, and that migrate rollback will essentially do that. It will go find the migrate map in the database there, and then just basically take all that data and pull it out of Drupal 8. Do you have a question?
Oh yeah, so that migrate manifest there?
Yeah.
Is that, I've seen people run migrations via like a shell script because it's a specific order they have to be executed in and it's not necessarily logical.
Yeah.
Often the case. Did you use that? And do you know what that is exactly?
I didn't use migrate manifest, but I like the idea of it. I think the it's analogous, or an analogy of it would be like a drush makefile.
Right.
So it just kind of like stores all your how you want your migration to run, essentially.
I assume it's a YAML too.
Yeah, I think so. This would have been really helpful. I actually didn't get to this point because I'll talk a little bit about the order of operations that I had to follow, because some of it was, I needed my content types first, then I needed my fields, and then I needed the data. So there's an order of operations there. If you're doing this manually, I had to step through all of these just because of the site was so large and kind of complex. I didn't want to botch it by just saying migrate everything, which you can do. There's a command to do that. So at this point, what we've done is, we've exported that configuration, that custom module. You enable the module, and then we have all those drush modules, the helper modules. Here, what I've done is I ran this drush migrate status, and that showed me a bunch of, basically just showed me a lot of information here. This is actually just a snippet of stuff, so don't take this literally, but this would normally say like your node type. It would tell you how many actual nodes you have in your database. This tells you like how many you've actually imported, how many have actually been unprocessed, things like that. This output winds up being really helpful to see the progress that you're making through the migration. Okay, so implementation. So this is kind of where it gets more specialized in kind of talking through some of my pain points and some of the things that I wound up experiencing along the way. This is kind of more the case study component, I guess, of it. But before that, you always need a little bit of extra information as far as like, the migration. Maybe this is a good preface, is that there's a paradigm here with the Migration API, and if you look at it, it's essentially extract your data, you want to transform your data, and then you want to load it back into the database. And you do that through plugins. Just the basic migration itself can pull the data and move it over, but really you want to be able to process, or you want to be able to maybe generate your own source data. Remember I talked about like custom tables. Those don't show up in the migration file, so that is something custom. I've got to go in there and I've got to actually write that query. In transforming your data, I had to figure out how to go about doing this. There's some hooks available to you. Sometimes what you're going to have is you're going to have, like in the instance of the media field, whenever I would try to migrate that field data, I would get a bunch of errors. Drupal would tell me, there is no migrate field over in Drupal 8. So what do I can't do anything with this data that you just asked me to migrate. And you wind up getting a bunch of errors. So a lot of the time, like one technique that I did was when you start getting those errors, your migrations are not completing. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to get as much migrated over as I could, then go back, and then, because there's all those files there, then I wanted to go back and find the ones that I had problems with, and then just focus on those and try to get those migrated individually. So what you can do is you can use this hook called migrate prepare row, and this hook, every row from the source database is passed through this hook. So in our custom module, I created a hook and to call this function right here. And then as I was passing through this data, I was kind of looking for certain things, like the media field, to kind of keep on that note. I needed to basically tell the migration to skip over that field. And then that's where this exception comes in to play. Migrate skip row exception. So I was looking through all the data. I was finding that particular field that I wanted to skip. Then I would throw this exception, and then the migration would continue. Here's an example of that hook. This is with some other information. Sorry, I should have made some more specific examples, but this is a function inside my custom migrations module in the .module file. And what I'm passing in, the row, the source, and then the migration itself. Again, a lot of those are all extensions of classes, which I was talking about earlier, which is why there's a lot of parameters in that array. So what this is basically saying is that all migrations have an ID, and it's just saying, hey, if you find the field migration, the one that's migrating all the fields, and then also the instance of where it lives, then I want to capture some things. Then I want to capture all these field names. These are the fields that say I want to skip. I don't really necessarily need it in my Drupal 8 instance. And then in this here, I'm telling it to find the source, the property of that field, the name of the field itself, and I'm saying if it's in this list of fields that I just put out here, then I want to skip over it because I'm going to come back to it and adjust it as needed. This is a really helpful. This proved to be really helpful. This hook for debugging as well. If I had problems with certain things, certain migration files, I basically just locate that file, and then I would either dump out the results or start pulling out certain properties to see what it was saying. It was a lot of trial and error. I mentioned the order of operations. I started following these certain paths. Like, for example, I can't migrate anything to media until I can't convert anything to media until I've migrated all my files over. I couldn't really migrate any fields or the field instances until I had my content types. I couldn't move my taxonomy terms over until I had my vocabularies, so forth. So this order of operations wound up, I started to build this kind of order of operations as I was going through. I'm going to talk about an example of an issue that I experienced with migrating a field, and then I'm also going to talk about a transformation of data using a transformation of location data. So knowing that I have my migrations in place, but I needed to transform them, I needed to create a plugin for my module. This plugin would allow me to either create a source, meaning I could write a query to query my old database to pull some information out from either a custom table or a table that is no longer in Drupal 8. Or I could write a process plugin to say there is a successful map of data, but I need to kind of transform it. Maybe I'm changing the date format. Maybe I am maybe I'm just finding certain things in a field and replacing it with some other data. That was actually my experience, was that I was using the media field module to embed my my media within the body page, like within the WYSIWYG. And if you look at behind the scenes, has anyone seen all that kind of gobbledygook of what the embed would do in WYSIWYG?
For Entity Embed or
For
V7?
for the entity embed. It was nasty. It was like a huge thing of like, just weird information, like file ID, and I couldn't find a picture of it, or because I had already migrated it. But essentially, it was just inside the body field. There was this huge kind of ugly embed code that, since I was moving to media, I could utilize Drupal 8's new entity embed module. So what I had to do is I had to convert that old embed code to the new embed code. And since this was all inside the WYSIWYG, I needed to, there was a lot of data in there. Like a lot of content editors had gone in there. They had physically embedded an image in their body, saved it, whatnot. I didn't want to lose that information. That would be a ton of information. It's a very image-heavy site. Lots of images within the, embedded right there within the body. So that was a big problem. It's like, not only am I upgrading to media, but I'm changing the way that it's embedded within the body. So I needed to process that field, the body field. So I generated a process plugin. Again, Drupal console generates all that boilerplate code for you. It actually puts it in the directories. It builds the architecture that's necessary within your custom module. So I ran this top command up here, and it answered, it asks you like a series of questions, like what do you want to call this? Where should it, what type of information do you want to add to it? And then, and then it'll say it's complete. In this case, I had created a process plugin and I called it UUID lookup. Why? Because the new embed, the way it was, the way entity embed was embedding code now, it was actually using the media UUID. So I needed a way to basically find that file ID, use that file ID, look up the actual media, and grab the UUID from it, and then update the embed code as a whole. Just show this example later. After this, I talked about creating a custom source. I ran this generate command, and it created a source plugin for me, and it stored it in the source folder. And I called it location geo. So this process plugin, my notes are kind of saying that I was trying to paint this picture for you, like I've got this body field and all this embed code in it. this is just a snippet of the node type that I was working on. It was a blog type. This is the specific field mapping for the body itself. In red is kind of the source, at the top there, body. It's saying this is the old field data, and everything on the right is kind of like the replacement or the processing of it. So in this migration, what's happening here is this kind of migration is rifling through all the data. It's looking for, it pulls up the body data. It's saying, okay, where does this body data need to go? Before I tell it where it needs to go, I'm using a plugin called preg replace, which is essentially a patch that I found that allowed me to do a kind of find and replace on the data stored in that body field. So the way that this plugin is set up is that it has a certain kind of format. It says, if you want to use this plugin, well, for one, say you're going to use it, tell it, you have to be able to provide it some sort of data so it can do something with it. It's a find and replace plugin, so you've got to provide some sort of pattern. This pattern basically just says, find this crazy block of code that has an FID right at the top, which is how it's constructed, in between all these different brackets and stuff. So once you locate that block of code, then you need to do a replacement. I want you to basically take that big block and replace it with this markup. This is the new entity embed markup. I basically installed the entity embed module. I saw how it was embedding within the content. So given that, I knew that how it did that was it basically worked everything off this entity UUID. So if I wanted to replace this crazy markup here with this new, much smaller, cleaner markup, I knew that I needed to find a UUID. So how do I find that? I need to find the FID first. So that's where the process comes into play. Notice that there's preg replace placeholder. Once I find my UUID, that's where it's going to go. It's going to be replaced right there. So here's the process. I'm saying, okay, what I want you to do with this, with what you find here, I want to set this value. So in order to set this value, I have to find that UUID. So here, this is my custom process plugin that I just created. And I'm telling it to use this class, or this plugin that I just created, and set a value of it.
It's kind of fun. I'm glad you learned this because I think people should start using this.
So then here's what the plugin looked like. So this is a transform function, and basically all you really need to know about this is value right here. This is what's being passed into from the previous. Value is basically the blob found from the pattern. So once that comes in, what's found from the pattern is that FID there. So that FID comes in here, and I use it to load the media element itself, and then I use this built-in method of UUID, which just basically gets the UUID from the loaded media value, and I just return that instead of the FID. So I know there's a lot going on there, and it's kind of high level, but I just wanted to show you, this was a problem that I had to solve basically, and I was able to solve it very easily with the Migration API. the fact that I could loop through each body field and say, do this find and replace, change this markup, was huge. I mean, this was like, I did this on, I don't know, 10,000 nodes or something, you know? The fact that I could do this easily, I mean, you know, it took a minute to get to that point, but you can see the power behind how these methods really help you out. So source plugin. Well, I'm getting really close here. All right, I'll go quick with this. So the source plugin, this is basically just, I'm querying the old database. I was using the location module in Drupal 7. The location module attaches itself to whatever node type you want, and you can add like lat longs, you can add addresses, whatever. But all that data is stored in a location table in Drupal 7. Well, I didn't need all of that. It's like too many bells and whistles. GeoField is very simple. It's just like, give me a lat and a long, and I'll create a, you know, I'll help you find a location on a map for your stuff. So what I had to do is I had to pull all the location data out of those location tables and move them into just the regular field table in Drupal 8. So this query, what this does, it says, go and grab the lat and longs and, well, basically just create a query. I need all this information from the location tables. Inside your source, you're able to define fields. These fields are used in the YAML file, the migration file. So here I'm saying, like, after you run this query, then you have some fields that I want to be able to use in my migration path. I'm going to need this information to be able to map up where that data needs to go properly. So then here's what that YAML file, that migration file looks like. At the very top, the source plugin, it's a source plugin. It's saying, you know, run that query that we just looked at. And when you run that query, it's going to return data. So now that I have this data, I need to process it. So here's where I start kind of plugging in those fields that I defined. You know, I had an NID, I had a type, a title, and then I had a new field location. And I was basically using a built-in migration path. So GeoField, Contrib module, had a pre-built migration path. So I used that to basically transform the lat and long data. The key thing here is that here's the destination. So because this was in a separate table and I needed to pull this data out, this was a completely separate migration. And what I was basically doing was that any time that you saw a field location, I was overriding this field with the new data. Okay, so I'm pretty much done with this experience. Some things that are worth noting are migration tags. So when you're creating your migration, you can define these in your migration files. So I started like marking all my nodes with nodes, all my terms with terms, so forth. That way I could run like big sets of migrations. So I could say, okay, now that I've run my files, now I want to run all my nodes. So I'd say drush migrate, tag equals nodes, and it would run anything that was tagged with nodes. Migration lookup. This is a built-in plugin. What this does is essentially just, make sure you want to rely on this for any type of entity reference, because what this does is it goes and finds the migration that you're trying to reference, and it makes sure that it has the right entity IDs and things like that. Some of the things, join the migration channel on Slack. I got a lot of help there. It was also really resourceful. I could go there and kind of present my problems, and some of the leading people in this whole migration API thing were there to be able to give me some advice and walk me through some things. So the last part I want to make sure I touched on was continuous integration. You mentioned like how do you deal with a site that is constantly being, content is constantly being added, and you're working locally. How do you keep that up to date? Well, the migration API is smart in that whenever it runs, if you can run it on top of previous migrations. So it'll look and say, hey, you've got all this information. I'm going to skip it, and I'm just going to add the new stuff. So the idea behind this is that you could build in these manifests, if you will, or the some sort of script to run your migrations anytime you say make a deployment. So if you're in a testing area and you're constantly like developing your Drupal 8 site, well, as you're deploying, maybe you want to incorporate some migrate commands to update your data. And that's it. So thank you for listening. And if you have any questions, feel free to approach me. Happy to talk about whatever. So thanks.